Welcome everyone to the first in what I hope will be a series of talks on academic integrity. The idea behind this is to provide a space for critical engagement and collegial dialogue around topics related to academic integrity and misconduct, with the goal of fostering a more just, compassionate, and restorative practice here at the U of W. Just a heads up to everyone that we're recording the session, and it'll be provided to attendees as well as to those who are unable to attend. We've planned for 15 to 20 minutes at the end for questions and discussion, but you can feel free to drop any questions or comments you have into the chat if you prefer to engage that way. So today we welcome Kerry Sinanan for her talk titled Abolitionist Approaches to GenAI and Academic Misconduct. Kerry is Associate Professor in Global Pre-1800 Literature and Culture. She specializes in Black Atlantic, Caribbean slavery and race, and the global dimensions of Black, Indigenous, and Caribbean resistance and abolition up to the present. Her monograph, Myths of Mastery, Traders, Planters, and Colonial Agents, 1750 to 1834, examines the writings in various genres by slave traders and slave owners from the mid-18th century up to British emancipation. She is under current contract with Broadview Press to produce a new edition of the History of Mary Prince. As an anti-racist pedagogy practitioner, she runs regular teach-ins and workshops on undisciplining 18th and 19th century studies and on decolonial curriculum. Thank you so much for joining us, Kerry. I'm really excited for your talk, so I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you everybody for coming at the end of term when you're probably exhausted and in lunch hour too. So I'll just crack on and I'll stop myself so we have time to chat at whatever point. I want to apologize. Obviously, when I wanted to do this talk and Ian offered a space for it, I was hoping I would have a lot more time to give to it. So think of this talk as really an assemblage of a lot of what Ian just introduced, which is the area that I'm coming from and how it's making me think about these categories. But before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking from Treaty 1 territory, which is the national homeland of the Red River Métis in Winnipeg, Manitou Abbey. These are the ancestral lands of the Anishinaabe, Anishinaabe, Indinuak, Oseti-Sakowin, Dakota Oyate, and Michif peoples. This territory is also a place of significance for the Desunilin and the Inuit, some of whom have been living here for generations. Acknowledge that this water we use is sourced from Shoal Lake 40 First Nation. Shoal Lake 39 is also impacted. And Treaty 3 territory, and that most of our hydroelectricity comes from Treaty 5 territory in northern Manitoba. And hopefully the importance of thinking about this land acknowledgement will become clear too as we go through the talk. The next slide, please, Ian. So my specialization is in 17th and 18th century transatlantic slavery, Caribbean resistance, and the making of white supremacy in the Enlightenment. And that's where everything I'm going to say is coming from today. I was educated in Trinidad. This is a picture of my primary school, which seemed a lot bigger when I attended. But it's also just to explain, geographical colonialism. I was taught by Irish nuns in Trinidad before I was taught by Irish nuns in Ireland. And when I moved to the north of Ireland, I'm from the occupied 6 counties. I was in a segregated education system designed to block Irish people from access to higher education. The 11+ exam still operates, and it was actually called the intelligence test when I had to do it. And I was just remembering today how I was put down to get the middle grade, which meant that you wouldn't get into grammar school, which meant that you couldn't go to university. And I sort of surprised myself and everybody else by getting an A. But the point is that eugenics are in operation in colonial education systems, and I've been through that. I did manage to, the next slide please, get a grant, a full grant at the time, I don't think these exist anymore, to then attend Trinity College Dublin, which was established for the Protestant ascendancy in the south of Ireland, founded by Elizabeth I in 1592 to colonise the Pale in Dublin. I was the only non-white student in a class of 80 single honours students in English. So I guess, again, this is my perspective. I'm keenly aware of systems designed to keep people in and out of education and academia. It is from this perspective that I approach these topics via my own work on anti-racist and inclusive pedagogy. This talk is an overall arguing for many divestments, really. Divestment from academic honesty as a category to be monitored, surveyed, policed or punished in our academic integrity systems, as well as divestment from generative AI, and they are connected. Ultimately, I want to draw attention to how current processes for dealing with academic integrity as academic dishonesty end up replicating systemic racism because they emerge out of the historical systems based on white supremacy. So there's two things. Academic integrity has a history. It's a category that has a history. That's okay, you can move on to the next slide, and is rooted in white supremacy. And the tools to police it replicate systems that are born on slave plantations, which I'm keenly aware of because that's my topic. And they're made to protect settler property and also to monitor Indigenous people and how they're knowing and learning. Generative AI intensifies the neocolonial structures of domination and regimes of penalizing, and overwhelmingly our academic integrity processes are penalizing students minoritized by race, disability, and most notably international students across Canada. So this slide, and because I'm an 18th centuryist, I'm going to begin with an 18th century poet who is called Phillis Wheatley, and she was an enslaved child who was bought by the Wheatleys at the age of 7. She was kidnapped from her home in Senegambia, and we'll never know what her real name was. Her name is a joint name. Phillis is after the ship that brought her to Boston after crossing the Middle Passage as a small child, and Wheatley is the name of her enslavers. She was not able to publish poetry. She was taught by them to read and write, and she was pronounced a genius by her enslavers. And she was brought to London, and under the patronage of Selina Hastings, she was able to publish her poems. And I'm writing about her right now as sort of an ignored presence in British poetry. If you just go to the next slide, I want to argue that the category for academic integrity comes from a slave-owning culture. These are Thomas Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia, and he dismisses Phillis Wheatley in 1781 as somebody who would be incapable of writing poetry, incapable of genius or imagination or originality because she is a Black person. So I want to note the way in which anti-Blackness is the subtext under all of these categories of academic integrity, honesty, which rely on the idea of the individual generating their own original knowledge. That's one of the things, or at least not replicating or copying knowledge. So this idea of honesty and how it's used really comes from a moral value system that was invented by white enslavers. So this is, I've redacted his racist language, but his notes on the state of Virginia really became a very important text for liberal democracy in America. And he said, I could never find a Black person who has uttered a thought above the level of plain narration, never seen an elementary trait of painting or sculpture. In music, they are not more generally gifted than whites with accurate ears for tunes and time. Whether they will be equal to the composition of a more extensive run of melody or of complicated harmony is yet to be proved. So that's dismissal of all forms of Indigenous Black music, which is actually copied by the North American musical industry. Misery is often the parent of the most affecting touches of poetry. Among Black people is misery enough, God knows, but no poetry. So he is the arbiter. Thomas Jefferson is the arbiter of genre, of composition, of originality, of imagination. Religion has produced a Phillis Wheatley, but it could not produce a poet. So So here is Thomas Jefferson. Because I'm an English lit person, he's setting himself up as a literary critic here too. Next slide, please. And he's dictating what counts as original composition. So I want to join these kinds of thinkings to bigger structures of white supremacy and to show how generative AI is really part of that. And a lot of the thinking I'm drawing on comes from the historian Gerald Horne, who in The Apocalypse of Settler Colonialism tells us that from the advent of Columbus to the end of the 19th century, it is possible that 5 million indigenous Americans, I suppose people on Turtle Island, were enslaved. So slavery coexisted on both continents of Africa and Turtle Island, leading to a catastrophic decline in the population of indigents across the globe. And he talks about the 3 horsemen of the apocalypse: slavery, white supremacy, and capitalism. And I'm going to just really show how those are still in operation today. Next slide, please. So bear with me. This is very much an assemblage talk, and I hope all the strands the relationship will become clear. So we've had Phyllis Wheatley in the category of originality and honesty coming from slavery. We've had the history of slavery as foundational to settler capitalism. And I'm going to leap forward now, and there's a lot of material out there about how generative AI and its infrastructures are the next stage in settler capitalist extraction. The Manitoba Premier, Wab Kinew, is very much behind this expansion, and he wants Manitoba to become positioned as a global leader in data storage. Now, having read the land acknowledgement, this is an article at the Narwhal, which is really detailed, and there's already a warning that raw materials and resources are very, very low in Manitoba. And for much of the summer of 2025, Manitoba, and indeed most of Turtle Island, was covered by smoke emanating from forest fires in the north. The land and its creatures and human life on the continent are suffering more extremely and regularly from the effects of climate catastrophe caused by the 3 horsemen of the apocalypse, as Gerald Horne said. So this emergency, I would argue, has to be linked to the discussions of academic integrity and generative AI. And so, yeah, we can move forward to the next slide. AI is the next stage of settler colonial extraction on multiple levels. It involves theft of raw materials, air, water, land, but also of human creative and intellectual output at the same time. In other words, it steals all of these and erases humans themselves. I don't know if anybody saw yesterday, but the Pope made an announcement about AI not being able to stand as authenticity before God. So this idea of originality is very much in play in critiques of generative AI. Like all systems of settler colonialism, generative AI lies about its theft. So Thomas Jefferson lies about his own theft of enslaved Black labour as he's orbiting taste and genius and intelligence. But universities are supposed to guard and produce knowledge, but they're also using generative AI. And then instead of punishing it for being a thieving system, generative AI steals knowledge and everything from the virtual world. It's stealing from books without acknowledging that there's a huge lawsuit right now. I forget which publisher, but they're suing for infringement of copyright. And any of us in academic publishing are realizing that to publish at the moment, we're being forced into signing away our rights to our books, or our social media sites are being used to train AI without our permission. So it's a very non-consensual extractive mode of theft. That is also stealing materials, raw materials. There's an article I've just written on decoloniality and racial capitalism, which is a book in the library, freely available, the Sage Handbook of Decolonial Theory. And I think AI has to be put in this context of the racial capitalist world order has perfected its ability to gather huge profits and the control of labour and resources to small and unaccountable groups based on the necessary incarceration, exploitation and deaths of racialised people within zones of neo-coloniality. I use the phrase zones of neocoloniality to capture the range of types of colonial systems at work that must be differentiated historically and geographically, but at the same time to be explicit about the ultimately extractivist goals of colonialism, which remain the same. Now, Canada is very, very much involved in global colonial extraction. This is just one example of the Ivanhoe mines, which got flagged by Amnesty International for ethnic cleansing. And there's another really good article here called Digital Shadows, Unveiling the Crisis of Forced Labour in the Tech Age, which is just one of the many articles detailing the ways in which, again, African enslavement is the labour behind the virtual world, tech world we're all using. So coerced labour forms. So this new tech world is, well, it's not even new, but the tech world is generating new forms of enslavement. Okay, so next slide here. I'm really, giving an overview here of some of the systems. Now, I want to leap forward. At the same time that all this is happening and producing the sort of infrastructure around our universities and learning, there are still in operation ideals of honesty, integrity that are not aware of their own history within white supremacy. So one way that we can really look at it is to go to the work of the philosopher Charles Mills, who was a Jamaican philosopher. And he says we don't really have a social contract. What we really have is an invisible racial contract. And I really want to place academic integrity within the racial contract framing, because it is an agreement between people like Thomas Jefferson that creates a white supremacist society, one in which white people control the vast majority of power, wealth, and privilege, and that's where the neo-colonial extraction comes into play. In the racial contract, white men declare themselves equals with equal rights, while defining non-white people as subhumans who do not deserve the same rights. So white people justify the system by perpetuating the racist idea that non-white people are inferior, as we saw with Thomas Jefferson. I guess what I'm trying to say is that as horrifying as Thomas Jefferson's ideas are to read, I feel they're very much in play in our systems of monitoring academic integrity across Canadian universities. The next slide, please. So even though it's a racial contract and not a social contract, the idea of humanities in universities pretends as if it's not, race-free, which is another lie. So the university, the liberal arts university, is very much based on this idea of humanism. Here we have Leonardo da Vinci's drawing. The ideals of proportion suggested by the architect Vitruvius reflected the idea that proportions can be found in the white male human body and then expanded out to the universe. So in a way, it's a symbol for the centrality of Western white man at the heart of the universe. Again, think of the university, for understanding the universe through the human by relating it to an apparently discernible order. So my subject, English, is consistently one of the most popular humanities subjects for employers and students. So what we really need to add into this is a critique of humanism. And if we do that job properly, then we also need to critique categories such as ethics, morality, honesty, and integrity, because they all stem from this very white, invisibly racialized idea of the human. And I'm drawing here, for those of you who want to think a bit more deeply about these very big arguments I'm making, Sylvia Wynter's essay, The Coloniality of Unsettling the Coloniality of Being, is where I'm drawing these ideas from. And she says the coloniality of being, power, truth, and freedom creates an ethno-class, i.e. a white bourgeois conception of the human. And we're given this idea of man, which overrepresents itself as if it were the human itself. Now, I think this overrepresentation of this category of the human is, again, invisibly at work in a lot of our categories in universities. The student, the professor, and all of us should have these things called integrity and honesty. And one of the ironies, of course, is that academics are the most plagiarizing bunch of all. Okay, next slide then, please. So in counter to this sort of humanistic, liberal idea of the university, many of us, many scholars, Gary Kinsman, who was here recently invited by the criminology department, Beverly Bain, University of Toronto, really names the fact that the university is part of a bigger carceral system. It says the liberation cannot occur. So if we're thinking about abolitionist approaches to this, can't occur if we pretend the university is not an institution tied to broader mediated social relations of power. The institutional relations of power of the university shapes class struggle globally. They are embedded in processes of settler colonialism, racism, and white supremacy. Universities and schools in Canada are built on Indigenous lands and on sites marked by decades of murder, disappearance, and ongoing genocide of Indigenous peoples. And of course, we can just look at the Wesley building at the front of our campus, created by George Young as part of the Red River settlement, as an example. Next slide, please. And this is another perspective from Yvonne Poitras-Pratt and Kita Gladue, who emphasize an Indigenous abolitionist approach. There are indigenizing efforts. We have one here at the University of Winnipeg across a number of Canadian universities as a basis from which to speak to a more inclusive and holistic definition of academic integrity. So now trying to move forward to think about these big things in relation to academic integrity. The authors seek to problematize the current neoliberal and commercialized approaches to education, where different forms of academic misconduct arise as if they are inevitable outcomes, but it's a system that's producing it. If education is viewed as the pursuit of truth, or more appropriately, truths, then it is essential to nuance the scope of academic integrity to include Indigenous perspectives such as holism and interconnectedness. And in many ways, each of these slides could be a whole article in itself, but there are people out there writing about these topics, encouraging us to think of new categories of collective learning rather than penalizing collaboration, for example. And if we just think of how knowledge has been very much individualized through this white Western humanistic category, I think that's one of the ways in which we can begin to break apart academic integrity as it's currently understood. Next slide. So unfortunately, the systems of generative AI we're penalizing a lot of students for copying, if you like, for using generative AI, instead of looking at the ways in which generative AI itself is the system of theft. That's really the main point I'm trying to make in disentangling these. So there's many studies. This is Danielle Boyer, who has a huge kind of project about how generative AI is threatening Indigenous language, again, by sort of stealing it, copying it, scrambling it to some degree, and moving it away from living communities and speakers who need to be there to transmit. And again, language learning is so against the model of academic integrity that we have, because in many ways language learning has to be common, it has to be based on copying. That's how humans learn. So Karen Howe is actually saying, it's generative AI that is repeating patterns of colonial history. European colonialism was characterized by the violent capture of land, extraction, resources, and exploitation. The AI industry is repeating this violence today, and that's what our focus has to be, rather than on penalizing students who are actually being colonized by generative AI. Next slide. So again, I'm not the only person pointing this out. Other people are publishing on it. So Jamie Paris at the University of Manitoba, sorry, I've misspelled. His name is Jamie, not Jim. There's lots of, I think most of us know that GenAI detectors are already biased against non-native English writers and biased for white English speakers. And Paris has written a very, very good article here that talks about policing feels at odds with the pedagogy of hospitality. It's the inverse of what Bell Hooks calls teaching to transgress. And here he also links these systems to the carceral university. We have professors acting as untrained police officers, defending an abstract idea of academic integrity. This is from Paris, combined with inconsistent rules around the use of generative AI across the university, subject to change from one faculty member or classroom to the next. What could go wrong? I think this is another huge problem, is that every instructor is doing it differently. We haven't been given clear ways to deal with this. To guard against the threat of conscious or unconscious bias impacting our international students, individual instructors must be mindful of the role of conscious or unconscious racism in how they identify potentially using AI and which students they accuse of academic misconduct. We need larger structural solutions. And I think it's a well-known sort of trend that across Canadian universities, and here at the University of Winnipeg, somewhere in the region of 80 to 90% of cases now being penalised for academic misconduct are non-white international students, along with an increasing rise in cases being submitted. Okay, so a Stanford research program found that, again, that these are the people being targeted. Okay, next. So because I am an 18th centuryist, I want to again jump back to the roots of academic integrity and think of the academic integrity has a history, and it emerges out of the honor code in the United States. And again, it emerges out of the universities that were the sort of founding fathers institutions. So William and Mary University is really where the honor code was first articulated, and it was given to it by William and Mary, so the British royals. And if you like, it was a kind of, I guess, a policing act by the British colonists to make sure that their university students, who would become their sort of rulers, kept faith with the crown. So it's coming out of a royalist tradition. William and Mary has been called the alma mater of the nation because of its close ties to America's founding fathers. George Washington received his surveyor's license and would return as its first American chancellor. Thomas Jefferson received his undergraduate education there. So Thomas Jefferson, William and Mary, academic honor codes coming from royalism, but Phyllis Wheatley and Indigenous learners are not counted. So I hope you can see these broad structures. So the honor code still is there in William and Mary, and look at the language. I pledge on my honor not to lie, cheat, or steal, either in my academic or personal life. And I just think we have to take note of a very big fact, which is that slave owners are the biggest thieves. And the Royal African Company, which was founded in 1660, things like the Asiento Accord, ensured that the profits of enslavement went straight back to the royal family, the British royal family, who are then institutionalizing these honor codes. So again, as each of these slides could be a whole essay in itself, but I just want us to really understand that academic integrity has a history, and it's created by a slaveocracy. Next slide. And the irony, of course, is that in founding this idea of honor codes, copying was still regarded as a legitimate form of learning. So again, this is because I'm an early modernist, but commonplace books are regarded as valuable manuscripts of white male humanists. So commonplace books were core to the English educational system. John Milton's manuscript is famous and people pore over it. And what was a commonplace book? A commonplace book is a compilation of quotations from over 90 authors, notes on kingship, tyranny, marriage, and divorce. And there is Thomas Jefferson's literary commonplace book. So again, as a literary scholar, I want to pause here and pay attention to the ways in which white men making compendiums based on their reading, based on their own literary criticism, that was regarded as a way of learning. And it's essentially copying. You copy stuff out and you select the best bits. And it's out of this process of sort of copying each other that white men are able to say, well, Phyllis Wheatley is a copier. She's not an originator. So that's a really, I mean, I feel like that needs an article in itself to think of that structure of how some types of copying are legitimized under honor codes and others are not. The history of exams, again, this is another article, lies in the 18th century, and it becomes tied to more standardized testing, again, in the 19th century, which becomes linked to eugenics. Prior to this, gaining a degree for white men was often conducted by viva voce. So again, we've shifted our standards to written to test non-white people. That's really, and working class. So as university admissions widened, the written exam became more common. Oxford and Cambridge developed exams for international entrants, mostly from India, in the 1850s, and as they began accepting students outside of the upper classes. So the whole idea of invigilation, monitoring, testing, it's all linked to eugenics ideas and chains of being hierarchies. Okay, next slide, please. Now, Donald McCabe is one of the people I would very much critique, because he has taken this idea of academic integrity in a very uncritical way and used it as if it's just an existing category that we all have to defend. And I think, many people do come to academic integrity in that way, as if it's just an unquestioned good thing, without a history and without a pretty worrisome context in settler colonialism. And McCabe really has a whole lot of these kinds of articles on academic dishonesty and honor codes that dates back over a century. But look at this language, it's just openly racist, really. He says the viability of such codes on today's campuses is open to some question, and not because they shouldn't exist, but because small, relatively homogenous campuses have now given way to large, culturally diverse institutions which lack any apparent sense of community or common purpose. So this carefully manufactured sense of white male honor is what McCabe is defending here. And I think it's really important to understand that a lot of the pedagogic materials that we get come from this unquestioning loyalty to protecting these very racialized ideals. So that's really interesting, and you can go into the history of Indigenous people being allowed into Canadian universities. All the anxieties arise whenever it's like borders, whenever people who shouldn't really be at university, like me, get into university. And of course, this is why we have a system that's overwhelmingly penalizing international students. Next slide. Again, I'm not the only person saying this. This is from the Daily Princetonian, where students have done a lot of research to show how the Princeton's honor code, which is tasked with holding students accountable and honest in academic settings, mirrors the criminal justice system and its rules and effects, so the carceral university. It is harmful to the entirety of the Princeton community because it instills fear in students and fostered an environment of academic hostility. And I know colleagues have held roundtables with students who now feel like they're under intensive modes of surveillance with our worries about generative AI. But the people who are being most harmed in this research and report are FLI, first generation low income students. So they are, like many students, afraid of disappointing family and friends, a lack of community support, and they're being penalized hundreds of thousands of dollars. And I think that's also important. The outcome of a lot of our systems for penalizing lapses in academic integrity is financial. The university is profiting from people having to repeat courses. And I think we need to, again, be very aware of that. Next slide, please. Again, because I'm an 18th centuryist, sorry, I did have a tea. That the AI is a huge economic bubble, and it will burst, and it's a mass form of theft. And the 18th century is when these bubbles really started to appear with the birth of racial capitalism. We have the South Sea bubble. We also have, again, the Royal African Company. But the South Sea bubble was called the world's first sort of Ponzi scheme, where people invested in what turned out to be nothing. And again, it was linked to the Asiento, which gave a monopoly on the profits of slave trading. So you can look it up yourself and see that AI bubble is some very much, every day Twitter is announcing that it can't wait for the AI bubble to burst. But there's a huge governmental, national investment, material investment, in making sure that it doesn't. And that is also a form of theft. So just to wrap up some ideas of what do we do about all of this, because I guess that's what people wanted to see, is like, what's the answer? But I'm doing all this because I think the answer, the next slide, when you're ready, Ian, the answer really is to interrogate all of these categories as a starting point and to start changing our thinking on a deep level. So Sarah Eaton is a very prominent abolitionist pedagogy expert, and she herself has for some time been calling for a post-plagiarism culture. The very nature of what plagiarism is has changed, because generative AI itself is such a plagiaristic machine that to blame a student for plagiarism no longer holds. That's one of the big, and our definitions of AI just are of plagiarism just don't take that into account at all. So the idea of a student as a locus of original non-copying learning is impossible. We can't turn on our devices or without seeing generative AI, and where the line is between, you know, any source of knowledge and a generative AI input is all becoming almost impossible to discern, and it's certainly not possible for students. So that whole category of what plagiarism is no longer stable. So Sarah Eaton argues for a post-plagiarism future, which means redesigning assessment, which means redesigning what we think are the categories being assessed in assessment to involve students. Now, Eaton still believes in this thing called academic integrity. To give technology literacy, I would argue for divesting from generative AI altogether. But again, to invest in support systems rather than detection systems. That's a huge shift. To create classroom cultures that value original thinking in the moment. Okay, the next slide. Just a couple more minutes. So Ian has drawn my attention to the McEwen's process, and it has a really good page on restorative approaches, which are a way of developing healthy communities to increase I mean, it is, again, based on a sort of decreasing crime and antisocial behaviour, which I hope I've disrupted that category a bit. But it is asking about accountability rather than punishment, collaborative ways of working through less ideal modes of learning rather than top-down punishment. So really to think about harm reduction there as a way of talking to students about learning. Next slide. I would be more in line with Feliciano and others who are arguing for abolitionist pedagogy. So in learning about abolitionist pedagogy, there are connections and relationships to socially conscious trauma-informed pedagogy, learning-centered. So instead of thinking of the student as somebody to put stuff into, to think of the student as a producer of knowledge. Decolonial and anti-racist pedagogy. Learning about and questioning what needs to be abolished is a practice deeply connected to socially conscious pedagogy. That's really what I'm trying to argue today. This is what we need to abolish. Next slide, I'm nearly finished. And I think if we really start to understand that's generative AI as an ideological project that's shifting authority and autonomy away from individuals, that's a really good way to start thinking about the fact that students do not have autonomy and authority in this world, and therefore our rights to punish them, penalise them, or assess them in certain ways really need to be questioned on a deep level. I don't know if I have a final slide or if that's me done. Let me see. Okay, here's the notes. So yeah, this is me. I'm writing a sort of bigger paper. Sorry, I should have put in black these links. So I would argue there is no ethical use of generative AI. While it's being widely and swiftly rolled out, its utility is being prioritised at the expense of considering its huge human and resource costs. There is no, UNESCO notes there's no governance framework in existence for AI. I propose a decolonial approach that does not put the burden on students for managing enormous systems beyond their control, but aims to take responsibility at institutional levels. It understands the university itself as part of the carceral system and therefore as a site in need of abolitionist and decolonial practices. This would involve understanding AI, generative AI, as part of white supremacist systems already in existence, and aim to reduce the criminalization of students within the university, but rather to see them as targets for and to large degrees victims of a technological revolution they have never consented to. Thank you. Okay. should have a last slide.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Kerry. Very interesting. I don't know if there was any elements from this last slide you wanted to
I
touch
guess
on.
it just says that we can trust students, learn together, think of students as knowledge carriers, think of ungrading practices, think of practicing things together, like we do in our homes with children perhaps, and just to divest from these categories altogether and these systems. I know that's a huge, these are all huge issues. But yeah, I'd love to hear what other people think.